Welcome to How to Get on a Watchlist, the new podcast series from Encyclopedia Geopolitica. In each episode, we'll sit down with leading experts to discuss dangerous activities. From assassinations and airliner shootdowns through to kidnappings and coups, we'll examine each of these threats through the lenses of both the dangerous actors seeking to conduct these operations and the agencies around the world seeking to stop them.
In the interest of operational security, certain tactical details will be omitted from these discussions. However, the cases and threats which we discuss here are very real.
I'm Louis H. Besant, the founder and co-editor of Encyclopedia Geopolitica. I'm a researcher in the field of intelligence and espionage with a PhD in intelligence studies from Loughborough University. I'm an adjunct professor in intelligence at Sciences Po Paris, and in my day job, I provide geopolitical analysis and security-focused intelligence to private sector corporations.
I'm Cormac McGarry. I'm an associate director at the global specialist consultancy Control Risks, where I help companies from every sector understand the implications of global geopolitical issues on their business.
In today's episode, we're discussing how to steal a masterpiece with Robert K. Whitman. Robert is the former senior investigator and the founder of the US Federal Bureau of Investigation's National Art Crime Team. Robert joined the FBI as a special agent in 1988. And during his 20-year career with the Bureau, he recovered more than $300 million worth of stolen art and cultural property. He has represented the United States around the world conducting investigations and instructing international police departments and museums in the investigation, recovery, and security techniques around art and cultural artifacts. In 2008, Robert retired from the Bureau and brought his expertise to the private sector, where he helps his clients mitigate risks related to theft, fraud, and forgery. Since its inception, Robert Wittman Inc. has grown to provide protection recovery services to more than 100 public and private collections worldwide. In 2010, he penned and published the New York Times best-selling memoir, Priceless, How I Went Undercover to Rescue the World's Stolen Treasures. And we'll make sure there's a link to that in our show notes. So, Robert, thank you very much for joining us.
Louis, Cormac, it's great to be here.
So the question we always like to ask our guests, and you've got such a fascinating background, I'm dying to ask, how did you get into your line of work?
Well, it was, I guess it was a issue of love. Back in 1988, when I first started, I enjoyed watching a television show, a series. It was called Miami Vice. And there were these two detectives that used to ride around on these cigarette boats in the Miami harbor. And they wore great-looking suits, and they drove these hot cars, you know. And one of them was Sonny Crockett, and I always wanted to be Sonny Crockett. So I thought, that would be fun. I think maybe I could do that in the FBI. So I joined up, and I put down Miami as my office of preference, someplace I wanted to go. And true to the Bureau, I ended up going to Philadelphia. A little bit different.
So, Robert, what sorts of crime actually fall under what we're calling the art and cultural crime categories? It's not something people are very familiar with compared to other hardcore crimes. Is it as simple as people just going into museums and stealing stuff off the walls, going into galleries, or is there more to it than that? Could you set the scene for us a little bit?
Sure, Cormac. Art crime is a $6 billion yearly business. It's one of the top 10 crimes, according to Interpol and the FBI. When it comes to property crime, art crime involves theft, fraud, forgeries, fakes. In fact, that's probably 75% of the art crime business worldwide today. It's not theft, but frauds, forgeries, and fakes. So people go in, they steal artwork. The reason for that is because it's so valuable. Back in the 1970s, you'd be lucky to see a Picasso sell for $1 million. But recently, within the last 5 years, a Da Vinci sold for $450 million, making that the most expensive painting ever sold. So as a result, criminals, they follow the market. They read the papers, they read the auction house reports, and they see that they're better off stealing a piece of art that could be worth tens of millions rather than going and robbing a bank and getting $1,000 and creating a federal crime in the United States. It's just a more lucrative crime if you can get away with it.
Let's dive in on these criminals. When I think about art crime, I think about the kind of gentleman burglar. I'm thinking of the Thomas Crown affair. I'm thinking about Lupin, which is really popular here in France. Who are the sorts of actors involved in crimes like these? I imagine they have to have an education in art, in artifacts. They have to know what they're stealing.
Well, what's interesting about that, Lewis, is that that's not really the case. From what I've seen in 35 years of doing these investigations, is that most of the time, these individuals who are doing these thefts, now they're doing the actual robberies and theft, they aren't really art aficionados. They're not only not knowledgeable about art and artifacts. What they're doing, they're criminals. And usually we call it a gateway crime because it's actually a gateway to get into these criminal organizations that are involved in, gun running, drugs, stealing cars, auto theft, even aggravated assault and murder. But one of the things they happen to do is an art crime. So basically, most of these criminals who commit these art thefts, they're better criminals than they are businessmen. Because they go out, they steal a $35 million Rembrandt, and then they don't know what to do with it. Basically, it sits while they look for a buyer. And then the buyer usually is going to be either a police officer, like myself when I was working, or a person who is coming in and going to report it to the police when they see it. So that's the problem. We always recover this stuff when it comes back to market. And unless you can move it and sell it, you can't profit from it.
And so does that mean that it tends to be more individuals operating alone, or do you see more organized criminality?
It's funny. We see both. We see private gangs of 2 or 3 or 4 individuals that get together to create the crime, and that's basically the definition under the UNESCO for an organized crime group. But we also see like the traditional mafia involved in art crime types of scenarios. And what I mean by that is they'll create frauds and fake situations where they can profit from it. There's different ways that they could do money laundering using artwork. So we see both, private individuals who go in and just commit an armed robbery versus organized crime groups who actually are involved in more sophisticated money laundering types of techniques involving art crime. As I say, it's a $6 billion industry every year. And that includes looting of antiquities, theft of artwork from museums, institutions, sales of frauds, forgeries, and fakes on the internet or in person. So all of this put together is a big crime market. Of course, you have to remember that the entire collectible market involving art, sculptures, prints, and all collectibles is $200 billion a year. It's a huge consumer market. The United States is the largest single consumer of art and collectibles at about 40% of the market, $80 billion. So it's a big market with the possibility of a lot of crime.
When I think about any big market like that, one thing that I often think about is insider risk. And I'm wondering, does the art world see much in the way of people working for museums and galleries and other collections taking part or facilitating in some way in the crime?
Yeah, it's a good question, Louis. We did a research back in the early 2000s on all of the museum thefts that had been solved. And we found that about 89% of art thefts in the United States from museums are inside jobs, or they have some insider aspect. It doesn't necessarily have to be an employee. It could be an expert, someone who's known as an expert that goes into the museum and they are researching items or looking at items, and they steal them as they go. I mean, there was one individual who was a well-known map expert. He was selling maps all around the world. He was a collector and a dealer, and he was in the Yale Beinecke library. And when he came out, he actually dropped an X-Acto knife. Well, an observant librarian saw that, called the Yale police, and he was found that he had just cut out a number of maps from rare books in the library. But when we eventually arrested him and indicted him, he had stolen more than 100 that he had given back to us that were returned to places like Paris, the libraries in London, New York, all over the world. And what was interesting about that? When the dealers heard about it, they said, it's interesting. We knew he was selling these maps, and we knew these maps didn't exist on the market. So we really couldn't figure out where they were coming from. But we knew something was up. And that's an interesting concept. The dealers know where everything is. They know where the maps are. They know where the collectibles are. They have, a basic finger on all the collections. That's what they do. So when these things pop up, they become very suspicious and are sometimes the first ones to call.
And so who's behind this? Who's commissioning it? Something we've seen over many of our episodes is that very specific crimes, for example, piracy, which we've talked about in episodes, we see that there's kind of a business empire around it. So I guess my question is, who's commissioning it? Or is it just lone actors?
That's a good question. Again, it's not a commissionable trade, so to speak. The idea that some rich benefactor is sitting in his cellar or his basement staring at stolen Picassos at night, drinking bourbon, or enjoying stolen Renoirs or whatever, that comes from a movie from 1962. And in 1962, there was a movie called Dr. No. You might remember that. It was a James Bond movie. It's the first one. And James Bond's walking through Dr. No's caverns, and he looks over and he sees a stolen Goya. And it was a Goya that was stolen the year before from a museum in London. And it's a true story. It really was stolen. So he looks at it and he kind of gives this look like, I wondered where that went. And he keeps going. And at that point, there was this, that created this legend that these individuals are sitting in their caverns with these stolen paintings. The real story there is interesting, though. Of course, a producer for the movie was in London and read about the theft. And so he had a copy made of the Goya painting, and he put it up. That was the painting that they used in the movie. And that's why there was a painting in the movie. Ultimately, after the movie was done, someone stole the copy. So you never know how it's going to work out, But from that, there's this theory. I call it the Dr. No theory that I'm always asked about these rich collectors who buy stolen paintings and hide them in their their basements. I've never seen that in 35 years of doing these investigations. I've never seen, a rich collector out there who is buying stolen art and staring at it at night. And there's a logical reason for that. Number one, even to buy a stolen painting, I'll give you an example. I did an undercover case involving a stolen Rembrandt. It was stolen at gunpoint from the Swedish National Museum in Stockholm. And so we did an undercover operation in actually Copenhagen, Denmark, where I posed as a authenticator for the Russian mob. And we were able to recover that piece. It was, like I said, worth $35 million. We were offering $250,000 in cash. So it was $250,000 in $100 bills. Well, to invest $250,000 into a stolen painting that you can't get good title to is kind of a nonsensical idea. Think about that a minute. What makes an artwork valuable are three things. It's authenticity, it's provenance, the history of it, and good title. Because if you can't transfer good title, it's like a three-legged stool. The leg won't stand up. And stolen artwork does not have good title. So as a result, you're not buying anything. You're basically, you're throwing your money away because you never can sell it. You can't take it to market. And if you die and leave it to someone, they're going to be stuck with it. So it's not a good idea. And that's why really rich collectors, they'd rather buy it outright, buy legitimate pieces than go in and buy stolen artwork that they could even be prosecuted for having done that. So it's not a good idea. And I've never actually seen that with very, very valuable artwork. Now, what I have seen is experts like that MAP expert and a few others who go into museums and they study artifacts and objects, specific objects, and they will steal a few because they feel like it's a strange thought process. They feel like, I understand this material. I really appreciate it. I know how it's made. I know all about it. Why shouldn't I have it? And they convince themselves that they're the ones who should have custody of the material. And they take it home. I've seen that happen a couple of times, after interviewing thieves after I caught them. And it's an interesting thought process, but it's not rich collectors paying for stolen property.
But does that logic extend to criminals seeking to make major money? So not the ones that want to actually go into a museum themselves, but they want to make the money from it. So I'm thinking particularly terrorist organizations. Is there any kind of precedent there of terrorist organizations committing art theft in order to get money?
That's a different question. The first part of it, the real art crime, art and an art theft and an art crime is the selling, not the stealing. But when we're talking about terrorist organizations, yes, terrorist funding does come up, does occur. Basically, in the Middle East, it's not artworks in museums. It's not, stolen paintings. It's basically antiquities. And what would happen is what was happening and what still happens today is sometimes these organizations will go in, they'll mine out antiquities and try to put them onto the market. They're very difficult to follow because these pieces have never been seen. They're new pieces that they take out of the ground. So as a result, there's no history on them. So to be able to prove that they're stolen or where they came from, it's difficult, which is why countries like the United States have banned material coming from a number of those countries at all. They won't let it come in because that's the only way to stop the trafficking for the international terrorism.
So you said something a minute ago that was really interesting. You said, how it's the selling it, not the stealing it, that's the real challenge. So how do criminals sell it? I've heard ideas of this use of a fence, someone that sits around waiting to buy up these goods and pass them on. Does that really exist? What is their goal if they're to shift this thing, and how does that selling process work?
Well, the selling process for any stolen property, it could be through a fence, that's a possibility, but not with art. And the reason for that is because artwork is usually unique. Now, you can sell prints, a print of an artwork. That's a different situation. But usually the ones that are invaluable are going to be limited editions, and they're going to have numbers that are going to make them limited, like 1 of 300 or 2 of 50, something of that nature. And so they're identifiable. So they're not unique. I mean, they are unique, you see. So every time someone sells an artwork that's stolen, it's almost like they're sending out an anchor. And that anchor goes out into the world with a chain. It leads right back to them. Okay? So in other words, it's a lead every time. And if a fence is doing that on a regular basis, sooner or later, one of those pieces is going to be identified as being the piece that was stolen because it's unique. And then that chain leads right back to the fence. And then the fence leads right back to the thief. So, law enforcement loves it when there's a fence out there who's actually trying to sell artwork because sooner or later, it's going to lead us right back to all of the stolen material. So I guess what I'm trying to say with that is, no, there's no fences who are selling stolen art because if it's not unique, it's not valuable. So as a result, there's no money to be made.
I feel, Robert, like every case you've ever worked on is extremely unique, bizarre, strange, and kind of entertaining to an audience like us. So I have to ask, what's the strangest or most bizarre item stolen that you have ever investigated?
A lot of the items that I've worked on and recovered, they all have different backgrounds. They're all from different places. That was the best part for me when I was at the FBI. As I say, a bank robbery investigator, bank robberies are bank robberies. Drug deals are drug deals. There's only so many ways you can sell a kilo of coke. You might hide it different ways, but to be able to sell it's just the same thing every time. But with art, you've always got to learn about the art. It's always different. I mean, there were times I was undercover in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I was working on the Indian Mafia, which was groups of individual dealers who were selling material that was stolen from the religious houses from the Native American Indians who lived on the Pueblos. So you had to learn about these types of items, they were selling, like eagle feather war bonnets, that type of thing. Other times, I remember I had a case involving a battle flag that was carried into the Civil War by one of the first African-American regiments in the Civil War. And probably half a dozen, 5 or 6 different soldiers were shot out from under the battle flag, carrying it in the battle. So it was considered a blood clot. And in recovering that, the history of that was so intense that, it was an important piece to get back. It was stolen. Another time I recovered another eagle feather war bonnet that was worn by the Apache medicine man Geronimo. And having that back was interesting. What was most interesting about that was the feathers were kind of ratty. They were 100 years old, and they weren't looking too good. This war bonnet. It was a 6-foot-long war bonnet. And it's like when you see the movies, from the head down all the way to the back. And it was, just made of eagle feathers. And a Native American tribe here near Philadelphia said, can we come in and do a smuggling ceremony on the war bonnet? So it was kind of interesting to have them come into the FBI office in Philadelphia and actually bring in smudging material, which is burning material. I was hoping that the smoke alarms wouldn't go off. They came in and they ran their hands along the eagle feathers with the smudge, with the smoke. And I'm going to tell you straight up, those feathers, and there was 3 other agents in the room, started to perk up. The bonnet looked like 5 times better than it did before they came in. I mean, it was almost mystical. And I've seen that happen. It was weird. I never would have supposed that it would happen, but it did. I recovered a piece of gold. It was a stolen, looted artifact from Peru. It was the largest piece of gold ever discovered in a tomb in the Americas. And it was looted from the ground in Sipan, Peru. And over the course of its 10-year period underground, going through person to person, no less than 3 people died with it in their custody. And it just had a bad, a bad mojo about it, where people who were handling it met their bad ends. So oftentimes I think that people who steal these types of artifacts and these things, there is a certain life to them or a certain power to them because they are a piece of cultural heritage that a lot of people, that our world has saved. And when you mess with that, there's a possibility you might be messing with the wrong spirits here. So, yeah, there's been a lot of interesting pieces.
What about valuable? I'm curious, what's the most valuable item stolen you've ever investigated?
You'd be surprised. The single most valuable piece was a original one of the first 13 original copies of the United States Bill of Rights. It was the copy that was owned by the state of North Carolina. It was sent by George Washington in 1789 to the state of North Carolina for ratification as part of the Constitution. And the state of North Carolina kept it. It was kept in their archives in Raleigh, North Carolina. And during the American Civil War in 1865, a trooper coming back north with Sherman's troops from Atlanta, the regiment stopped, and they took over the State House in North Carolina and made surrender. They went in, one of the troopers went in, and he stole the Bill of Rights from the State House. He was an Indiana trooper. He took it back to Indiana. That's where it stayed. And ultimately, it was being offered for sale to the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And it was being sold for $4 million. We did another undercover operation on that one to recover that because there were some threats that it might end up in the Middle East or be destroyed by someone who's involved with terrorists as a symbol against America. But anyway, we were able to recover that. And ultimately, that piece, if you could sell that, in other words, you can't. All right, it belongs to the government, to the state of North Carolina. But if you could sell it, it was evaluated to be around $100 million. It's the only other documents that would be worth more would be maybe the Magna Carta or the Declaration of Independence. But this particular piece, if it was able to be sold on the open market, would have been $100 million.
Robert, I want to swing back to some of the functional side of how the crime works, and I'm interested in the role that insurance plays. So how much of stolen art is done with the aim of cutting a deal with an insurance company? And also on that question as well, is there ever cases where ransoms are sought? So rather than trying to resell the art in a black market, will they try and ransom it off to the original owner?
Good question on both ends. And the first question about it, is it ever being offered back to the dealer? I mean, to the insurance company. That's not usual. And when it does happen, the thieves get caught because then we do an undercover operation. We act as an appraiser or as an insurance dealer, and we go in and arrest them. That usually doesn't happen. Now, some of these things, we have to look at worldwide situations. When it comes to the ransoms, in the United States, that's not legal. So it's considered obstruction of justice. So basically, it doesn't happen that way. But, let's just say a criminal gets caught doing drug dealing, and he has information about, a stolen painting that's worth $10 million. And he's willing to give up that information and maybe work with the investigators to recover the painting and capture the individuals that stole it. They might be able to get a downward departure in sentencing on the drug deal. You see, in other words, not for the painting because they weren't involved in that, but for the drug deal that they were involved with. Let's say they're looking at 5 years in prison. Maybe they can get that sentence down to 2 years. That would be a situation where they might work for a downward departure. It's not a ransom. It is, but it is a benefit to the informant. Okay. Now I know in Europe, there's a little different situation with the laws. And so sometimes deals are made to help criminals do what they want to do, to get out of prison or to get other people out of jail. Sometimes they can do that. I know of one group I had worked with in France that had multiple paintings that they had stolen. And they were basically using them as get out of jail free cards. So whenever they were caught with something or a situation, as long as it wasn't too serious. I mean, if it was a murder or something of that nature, no. But if it was a stolen car or something, they could make a deal and try to use stolen paintings to get themselves, again, a downward departure in any type of sentencing. And the reason I know that is because I was undercover working in the south of France, and criminals were telling me this is what they were doing. So, because they knew, the interesting thing about that, the reason they did that was because they stole the artworks, but they couldn't sell them. And so, as I kept saying earlier, they couldn't make any money. So what they did was they kept them as get out of jail free cards instead of trying to monetize them.
I just want to follow up on something you said there. You've talked a couple of times about going undercover, and for this season of the podcast, that's been a real theme. We've had John Mendez, the CIA's former chief of disguise, come on and talk about how building fake identities worked. We had Olivier Mass, a former DGSE clandestine services officer on. So this feels very thematic. How does going undercover work in the art crime world? How do you establish your credentials as, the fake appraiser or whoever it is you're supposed to be?
Well, basically, there's a lot of different techniques to working undercover. The one I always used was to be yourself. In other words, not try to put on a disguise. I never put on disguises or change my voice or, try to come up with a fake accent because those things can be seen through. So for tradecraft, what I would do is just be myself. I would tell truth, and truth is easier to remember. Sometimes these cases might go for 6 months, a year, 2 years. And, if you start lying during the period of the undercover, you can't remember what you said. And there's a lot of different ways of doing that. If you live in a city, just live in that city. Don't try to say you live somewhere else because ultimately you'll meet someone who did live in the other city and he'll know more about it than you do. And so these are ways that you get caught. So basically you be yourself and you act like who you are. Whenever I was undercover, whether it was as a dealer, a shady dealer or an authenticator professor or, a buyer who had no knowledge, I always believed that's who I was. So when I was working in that case or working at that moment, I believed who I was. And that's how I could work it. Now, the reason I could do that is because the real part of art crime, it's not the history of the art or anything about the art. It's how to do a deal in the art world, the business deal in the art world. And luckily for me, my parents were antiques dealers. So I knew how to do a deal, and I do know how to deal in the art world. And so criminals basically who are not usually involved in the art world don't know how to do that, and they need someone to come in and be that person. I remember one case I did in Madrid, Spain, working again as an authenticator for some Eastern European mob group. And I was an American who was working for them on consultancy. In other words, they were paying me a fee. And the guys who did the actual robbery, about $65 million worth of paintings, they said to me they were so happy to meet me because they were planning on doing a heist at the Van Gogh Museum. And they needed an expert like me to come in and help them sell it. So they were going to conspire with me to do these other jobs, while we were catching them on these $65 million in paintings they stole from Madrid. Ultimately, they were apprehended, and the paintings were recovered as well. So that's what it is. You have to believe in what you're doing, and you have to be comfortable with who you're actually acting as. Put it this way: you see what I look like. I wouldn't make a good, biker. That's not my thing. You have to be who you are, and as a result, it works out okay.
On a recent episode of this season we did, it was called How to Rob a Bank. We had a former colleague of yours from the FBI, FX Reagan, come in. And one thing he really left me with is this idea that the average bank robber makes almost no money, that it's a really high-risk crime for very low reward. You talked about this a little bit earlier, but I'm really keen to dive in. What about art criminals? Why would someone be an art criminal versus, let's say, a bank robber?
Coming back again to the values, the average bank robbery in the United States is less than $1,000. That's how much is actually taken. And just to give you an idea, recently a Mickey Mantle rookie card, baseball card, little piece of cardboard for the 1950s. It sold at auction for $12 million. Now, this is not autographed. This is just a rookie card on the first year that Mickey Mantle played baseball. And so if you can go and steal this baseball card out of a collection and sell it, even if it's in terrible shape. This one was listed as a number 9 out of 10, so it was in good shape. But even if you get one that's a .05, it sold for $84,000. So what that says is that these criminals can go into these homes, steal somebody's baseball card collection, and then come out and make a lot more money than they could robbing a bank. By the way, a bank robbery in the United States is a federal crime. Stealing a person's baseball card is a local crime. And can you imagine the result when you call the local police department, say the New York City Police Department or the Philadelphia Police Department, and you have someone on the line, you say, somebody stole my baseball card? It's not going to have much impact, with the investigation. So it's a whole different world now because of the value of these collectibles and the valuable that's out there. And then the other thing on that, and I hate to say this because I hate to tell people how to do crimes, but these baseball cards are not identifiable. They don't have serial numbers. They're not unique. So as a result, even if it's stolen and it's found, how do you identify it to give it back to the owner? Because there's multiple out there, quite a few. And how do you know which one's yours? Unless you have certain markings or things like that on it. But ultimately, it's very difficult to identify them.
Can I just use that anecdote as a nice way to color what you already explained a while ago in terms of who the buyer is? So an $84,000 let's call it street value of the baseball card. Who's the person paying that money? And what kind of character is that? Are they aware that it's stolen? Or does the fact that it's stolen even increase the value to them? Or does it decrease it because they're like, I have this valuable card, but I can't show it off because people are looking for it?
Well, the $84,000 card, Cormac, was sold at auction. It wasn't stolen. So, I mean, what I was doing was telling you how even a card that's in terrible condition, that card is still worth $84,000 versus the $12 million one. But that's a good question. So the person who's going to buy that, well, again, I hate to tell people how to commit crimes, but because you cannot identify these Mickey Mantle baseball cards, if you do come across one, you could make a lot of money and, you have a hard time getting caught because it's difficult to identify it.
We're talking to Robert K. Whitman about the incredible world of art and cultural crime. After the break, we'll talk about protecting and recovering these items.
You have been listening to How to Get on a Watchlist, the podcast series from Encyclopedia Geopolitica. If you like this show, don't forget to check out our other content at Encyclopedia Geopolitica, which you can find at howtogetonawatchlist.com, where you can find our analysis on various geopolitical issues, as well as reading lists covering topics like those discussed in the podcast. Please also consider subscribing to the podcast on your streaming platform of choice, giving us a rating, and joining our Patreon.
So let's talk a little bit about protecting and recovering these items. Let's start with the protection piece. How do institutions like galleries, museums protect priceless items from being stolen? And then a kind of second question to that is, you talked earlier about private homes. How do private homes with very expensive high-end art, do they try and mirror these institutions? How does protection there work?
Well, in today's world, of course, there's a lot of IT out there. There's a lot of technology involving alarms, metal detection, movement detection. So, what we do in my company is we do a lot of security surveys for museums, and we give recommendations on things that we see, and not just institutions, but also for private homeowners. And basically, it's layered protection. It starts on the outside with lighting. It's layered lighting coming into the house, into the institution, and then movement detection within the institution, and then alarms as well. And there's basically three aspects that we talk about. The one is human relations. In other words, you got to have guards. You got to have people who actually know what they're doing. Then electronic surveillance. Electronic surveillance is only good if the guards turn it on at night. That's what I mean by that is when we speak to people who have homeowners, not institutions so much, but homeowners, they have to be able to operate the material. So the human aspect to actually operate the material, turn it on. And then, of course, we have the alarm aspects, which is, how does the alarm go off? Where does it get reported to? So it's a three-phase system for whether it's an institution or a home. It's always the same. And that's what we look at. Now, remember, basically, all of these things are deterrents. Ultimately, if somebody wants to come in with a handgun or a rifle and rob the house, rob the museum, they're going to do it. And we tell people to let them have the objects. We'll get them back because we can get objects back, but we can't bring people back to life. So it's ultimately a deterrent situation. Depending on the value of the collection, how much deterrence we can put in.
Robert, I know you've painted a picture for us of who the criminals are, but I feel like we're desperate to get a Thomas Crown type character out of this. Is there any cases you've worked on where the criminal was particularly clever, brazen, where they exploited some major vulnerability or security failure at the target?
Well, up to this point, we've talked about art theft. These individuals who basically go in and do a low-level crime, which could be a gunpoint or just a burglary where they go in and steal art. But when we talk about the Thomas Crown types of criminals, now we're looking at the other set, I call, of crime. And that's the frauds, forgeries, and fakes. And that's a little bit higher level, especially with the forgeries and fakes. There's a difference between a forgery and a fake. A forgery is a painting that's actually a copy of one that exists and that someone tries to sell as the original. Okay, so there's an original Renoir, they copy the Renoir or a Chagall and they try to sell it in a market somewhere else. And they say that's the one. Whereas a fake is a painting that's done in the genre of an artist. It looks like a Cezanne. It looks like a Renoir. And then what they do is they say, well, this is something new. It's never been seen. This is an authentic piece that we've just found. And that's a fake. So these are a little bit more sophisticated because the individuals who are involved in this have to actually know what they're doing, have to know what the painting's supposed to look like, have to know how to create the painting if that's what they're going to do. They're actually artists. And then you had the fraud. Now, of course, in both of those cases, the ultimate crime is fraud because they're selling something to someone and that person's relying upon their information and suffers a loss. And that's basically the definition of legal fraud in the United States. But there's other ways of committing fraud. And that would be like people who are not involved with fakes, people who go in and underbid clients. In other words, they go in and they say, your specific artifact is only worth X, and they turn around and sell it for 10X. And the people who actually sold it to them for X believed that this appraisal was legitimate. So that could be a fraud. The use of the computer with email, that could be a wire fraud. Or the use of a telephone, it's a wire fraud. Use of the U.S. postal system or FedEx or UPS, those are mail frauds. So whenever these individuals, these fraudsters use these different carriers and they send this information out to a prospective victim and the victim suffers a loss, they're committing a crime. So these are all ways that these individuals do this. Now, it's a little, like I said, that's a higher standard, should I say, than people who go in do armed robbery. I mean, that's a whole blunt, crime with basically, using force. These frauds, forgeries, and fakers, they don't do that. They bilk people, and there's a lot of victims. Right now, 75 to 80% of all the crime in the art crime market is frauds, forgeries, and fakes.
Okay, and I guess then from a law enforcement perspective, that requires different solutions, right? In terms of the investigative process, could you maybe lay out for us, what does the investigation process look like from the moment of an item being stolen and also a fraud being committed?
Well, the whole investigative process for an item being stolen, when an investigator first goes in, it's like any stolen product. You look for forensic evidence, hairs, fiber, footprints, anything of that nature, maybe fingerprints. You look at the technique that was used, the ingress, the egress. You look for video surveillance. There's ubiquitous video surveillance now everywhere. Everybody has Ring cameras on their doors and everywhere else. So that's what you basically look for in the very beginning of any type of investigative crime involving a theft. Then you would go and check with the registries, the RLAW's registries, the National Stolen Art File with the FBI, make sure that these registries all have the artwork stolen listed in the registries, and then talk to dealers. Usually, a piece that's stolen, say let's say the Mickey Mantle baseball card. You're going to go to Mickey Mantle. You're going to go to sports dealers, sports card dealers, and make sure they know this card's out there and it's available. And that way, you can set up a informant network that'll get back to you when the piece ultimately ends up, coming to market. As far as for frauds, forgeries, and fakes, that's a different situation. First, you have to interview the victim. So you want to go, and once the fraud is identified or the forgery is identified, you go to the victim and you have to find out what they were told, how they were told that, whether any of that was done, like I said, use of wires or the mail, and then you can go backwards from there and see if you have the evidence, the emails, the phone calls, maybe were taped, anything like that, and then go from there to determine whether or not you have enough evidence to be able to actually prosecute and convict a criminal.
Are there rewards for these kind of informants, for people who participate in the recovery process?
Sure. The biggest reward usually for confidential informants and for people who are cooperating witnesses is that they're usually indicted for something else, and they get a downward departure in their sentencing when they come to trial. I had a case involving that Rembrandt. That was a $35 million Rembrandt, Sweden. The cooperating witness was a drug dealer in Los Angeles, and he was looking at 10 years in prison on two kilo buys from one of our drug squads. And so he came in and he cooperated, introduced me physically to the thieves in Sweden, and at which point we recovered the painting. He was given a downward departure. He was looking at 10 years in prison. He got a probation. That was the biggest downward departure in California federal court's history, from 10 years in jail to probation. So as a result, he did receive a nice reward for his efforts. Occasionally, too, museums. Right now, the biggest art theft in the world, done at one time, was a theft in 1990 from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. On that night, St. Patrick's Day night in March, two individuals dressed as Boston police officers went to the museum late in the early morning hours, and they convinced the two guards to let them in. Of course, they weren't police officers. They were thieves. They tied the guards up to pipes in the basement, and they went throughout the whole museum and stole 13 objects of art. The total value at that night was $300 million. Today, those paintings are still missing. This is 34 years later, and they're valued at $500 million. And the museum's offering a $10 million reward for the recovery of the paintings stolen from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. They included a Vermeer. It's the only Vermeer that's missing in the world, called The Concert, and a Rembrandt seascape known as The Storm over the Sea of Galilee, the only seascape known that Rembrandt ever did. So you can see that $10 million is a pretty nice payday for someone who could come up with those paintings.
Do these stolen items often end up moving over borders, being transferred around the world? And if so, from the criminal's perspective, how do they smuggle it across borders?
Well, interestingly enough, the Rembrandt that was stolen in Sweden, in Stockholm, we recovered in Copenhagen, Denmark. And they brought it down from Sweden to try to sell it to me in Copenhagen. And just to give you an example, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum paintings, again, none of them have been recovered. But I was undercover for 2 years, chasing the Rembrandt and the Vermeer, working with thieves out of Miami. and we were negotiating the buyback of those two of those paintings for $30 million. And again, I was acting as a shady dealer, and I was working with a French criminal from Marseille. Interestingly enough, we were able to recover 4 paintings stolen from the Fine Arts Museum in Nice, a Monet and a Sicily that are still today hanging in the Musée d'Orsay, and 2 Bruegel stolen from the Fine Arts Museum in Nice. And in that case, we also recovered 2 Picassos that were stolen from Diana Picasso, her apartment in Paris, ultimately working undercover with the French police. Well, we didn't get our paintings. Unfortunately, my cover was blown, and the thieves at that point said that they weren't going to deal with me anymore. But we did recover those other pieces for the French OCBC. So they do move. Paintings do move. They go across borders. And the reason for that is because paintings in and of themselves are not contraband. Money, guns, these are contraband. Drugs, they're all illegal within themselves. But paintings are not necessarily illegal within themselves. So customs officers oftentimes don't recognize these pieces as being stolen. They don't know. How would they know? And so they go past across international borders rather easily, and especially in the EU, where the borders are open. So basically, they can go from Germany to France to Spain, and there's no issues. Yeah, they do move easily across borders.
Which makes sense because you've been talking a lot about the amount of traveling you've done in your career for casework. So from an FBI perspective, how does that work? Because I imagine most countries in the world will not have an FBI. They don't have specialists in this space the way the FBI does. How does it legally work? Do you get invited by, let's say, a European country? Do you get invited by the law enforcement agency to come in?
Well, surprisingly, Cormac, it's really, there are a lot of countries that do have specialists. As I was saying, in Paris, we have the OCBC. They have more than 30 investigators that are part of the gendarmerie and the national police. There's 2 full squads in Madrid, and Spanish art theft squads. London has the Metropolitan Art and Antique Squad. Carabinieri in Italy, they have more than 200 investigators, 2 brigades of antiquities investigators in Italy. So a lot of the different countries do have. Now, when you talk about, Romania, Hungary, these other countries, no, they don't have a specific squad. Even Germany has 2 investigators. So the way that works with me, or was working with me, and still works today, is that we would develop some type of lead out of the United States. And then what would happen is we would talk to the specific country, whether it's Germany or from Spain or whatever, and we say, look, we've got this lead, and through our embassy, our legal attaché in that country, and we would say, we want to work with you to try to recover this material, and we can do this or that. Now, in France, I really couldn't work undercover. You're not allowed to do that in France. In France, the only people who can work undercover is a specific group within the National Police Agency. Anyone else would be actually breaking French law. But places like Spain, Denmark, Sweden, we could go in and work with the police as undercover operatives. So it depends on which country that you're going to. That you have to follow the laws of the country. Actually, I remember twice I was actually arrested after doing the deals because the attempt to buy stolen property in that country was illegal. So as a result, the police had to arrest me, take me to a magistrate court. Of course, they knew what was going on, and they let me go. And so as a result, we had to go through that process in order to be able to do the cases. I remember one time I was in Warsaw, Poland, and we recovered these very valuable items that were stolen from the National Museum in Zimbabwe, in Harare. And they had been stolen. They got away with them. They took them they smuggled them to Poland, and they offered them for sale to a dealer in the United States. That's how we got wind of it. And at that point, I went undercover as a buyer for the dealer in Warsaw. I went to Warsaw. Unbeknownst to me, the Polish National Police had not talked to the prosecutors in Poland. And so they didn't know I was there. But the SWAT team knew I was there. They helped out. So we did the thing very quickly. We got the case done. The individuals were arrested, and I was out of the country by the next morning. So we got the work done, but we didn't have all the paperwork done correctly at that point. When I got back to the United States, the prosecutor had asked the FBI to look into this person who was staying in Poland trying to buy stolen property. So I actually got the lead to investigate myself. And so it worked out well. In the end, Zimbabwe was happy, the Polish police were happy, and we got the material back.
Is there some sort of international body that coordinates this kind of stuff? I'm wondering, does UNESCO have a role in this? Who manages this kind of stuff?
There's no actual international body that coordinates what I would call undercover work. Every country has their own statutes, their own laws, and we would work together, to try to do what we needed to do. It's called foreign police cooperation at the FBI. But there are certain international bodies that do try to coordinate some of this. Right now, there's a group at the OSCE in Vienna, and there's a task force. I'm actually a member of that task force that has put together I guess by this point, probably 20, 25 countries that have representatives on this task force, police officers, prosecutors, archaeologists, different types of scientists that work together to help each other in cases that come up. So if there's a question in Switzerland and the prosecutor has some question about U.S. law, they can contact me. Or if there's a question, say, in Croatia. And we have every 2 or 3 months, we'll have meetings. And so I think the last one was in Malta. And so we go and have meetings with the groups, and we train local PD, local police officers, prosecutors, customs agents on how to stop the transnational progress of stolen property, stolen cultural art.
I'm learning a lot here. I still feel like there's going to be places where there's gaps where you can't necessarily deploy specially trained police officers. And I'm assuming that the private sector fills some gaps here. And I'm really curious to hear what role the private sector can play, does play. And of course, Robert Wittman Inc. being part of that private sector. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I am the private sector. I used to be the law enforcement, but not anymore. So what I do now, oftentimes, I'll get a call from, it's kind of frustrating. I'll be honest with you. And the reason I say that is because, law enforcement often does not take this seriously. Art crime is often looked at as a victimless crime. It's people think of it as being something like, that's some rich guy who lost something, valuable, and who cares about that? Well, the truth is that we all care because, number one, it's a piece of cultural heritage. It might be owned by a specific person today, but, next month it might be in a museum, or next year, whenever it's going to be. And it's a piece of cultural heritage that we all have an interest in. Secondly, it affects insurance prices. If someone has to pay, someone loses a Renoir or a Picasso worth $10 million, the insurance company's going to pay off. Well, guess who pays that? Ultimately, all of our premiums go up. It's just like a hurricane, or a natural disaster. Somebody has to foot the bill, and ultimately it's going to be all of us. So it's not a victimless crime. So as a result, it's frustrating sometimes that the law enforcement doesn't take it quite as seriously. And when I say law enforcement, I specifically mean law enforcement on the street, beat cops, that type of thing. So I get calls from victims who just can't get an investigation done, a serious investigation done on their loss. And what I'll do is I have to start all over from the beginning and basically try to put a whole case together, which I usually do, put a case together using the investigative techniques that I have, and then presenting it to either the FBI or the local PD or Homeland Security investigations for prosecution. I've found that that's a good way to do it because basically if you can put the whole case together and hand it over like with a nice bow on it, oftentimes they'll take it because, nobody wants to work really hard. I hate to say that, but it's the truth. So that's really the process in the private sector for these types of situations. Sometimes too, you in the private sector, you go out and do an investigation and, you're not successful. You can't recover the material. That's frustrating because, when that happens, somebody's going to be the victim of that. But that's all part of the private process. Also, too, the private process involves security management. Police officers, police departments don't come in and create security for institutions or for collectors' homes. So they have to rely on the private process to do that. And as a result, you go in and you're protecting people, creating deterrence so that they won't become victims.
I just want to follow up on what you said there about recovery, because I imagine, as you say, this is either cultural heritage or it's something that someone's going to care a lot about personally if it's a private collection piece. How likely is it an item is recovered? Is there a proportion of cases where you do get the objects back?
That's a good question, Louis. I would tell you right now that probably, of very high value artworks, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum theft is really an outlier. I mean, those 13 pieces were taken. None of them have been recovered, and it's been 34 years. That's very much an outlier. Usually, I would say 90% of the time, high-value art thefts are recovered. Artworks are recovered because it doesn't do any good to destroy them, and it doesn't do any good to hide them forever. Eventually, they're found. All of these pieces are going to outlive us, at least we hope. And so, in the end, they come back to the market or come back to the world. In fact. So the very, very high value material comes back. Now, when we talk about just property crime in general, it's about 5 to 10%. It's recovered. And now we're talking about televisions, computers, things of that nature. But high value artworks are more than likely going to come back. Now, low value pieces that are like in the $5,000 to $10,000 market, they can go on what we call the secondary market, which could be small auction houses, flea market, private sales. They can sometimes go under the radar because they can't be identified, number one. And because of the low value, they're not on the stolen art registry list. So sometimes that can happen. But that's not worthwhile. In other words, if someone goes out and steals a dolly print that's worth $300 and they sell it for $50, it's really not worth the time or the effort. So that's, we're talking about high-end art here. It comes back pretty much 90% of the time.
So the question we always like to end this show on, what keeps you up at night? What was the worst case scenario in this world that really worried you?
I guess in my career, there were 2 times that I was really worried. It was the first time I ever went undercover. An individual came into a jeweler in Philadelphia, and he said that he was a operative for the CIA. And he showed the jeweler CIA credentials, a ID card and his badge. And he gave the jeweler $80,000. And he said he wanted to buy diamonds for his informants in Europe. And so he wanted loose diamonds. He wanted $1 million worth of loose diamonds. And he gave the guy $80,000 to start out to prove he was legitimate. So the jeweler said, okay, I'll see if I can come up with $1 million worth. And of course, he called the FBI and got me. And he told me the situation. And now you have to understand, the CIA doesn't hand out credentials. They don't have badges. So none of that is none of that's legitimate. So we knew it was a fake. So I said to him, "Oh, tell him you're going to meet him. You'll come to meet him at his hotel. And when you do, you'll have a briefcase with the $1 million in diamonds in the briefcase." And they said, "We're going to do this." Now, this was on a Friday. So I told him that we'd meet him on Monday. So I had the whole weekend to think about how this guy could get me, okay, which was a bad idea. I should have done it the next day, but I had a whole weekend to just sit and worry about it. So when we got there to the hotel, my first thought was they were going to, get me coming across the parking lot. All he had to do was drive up, pull out a gun, shoot me, and grab the briefcase, right? That's all he needed to do. Well, I had to walk across the parking lot, and I got into the hotel. Nothing happened, thank goodness. I get in, I call him, I say, "Come on downstairs to the lobby. We're going to, I want to meet with you." And he says, okay. He comes downstairs. And now we had agents all through the lobby of the hotel. And he says, "Don, I want you to come upstairs and talk to me now." And I said, "Well, first, let's talk about this here a little bit first." And he saw that I had the briefcase and it was attached to my wrist with a handcuff. And I said, "Well, I'm not going to go up to your room. Let's just do it here." And he said, "Okay." And at that point, I called in the agents and we arrested him. Well, what was interesting, he had a hatchet and a gun on him. And the reason was he was going to take me up to his room and cut my arm off. And he had all the mirrors in the room turned around so that we were fighting, he wouldn't fall into the mirrors. And he had left a suicide note. And he had parked his car right under the window of his room so that he could go out the window and jump into his car. So we were able to catch him in the end. And he got 5 years, for attempted robbery. So that was the first time. And the mistake there, the thing that worried me was that all weekend, I had all that time to sit around and worry about it. And then the second time was, I was working undercover in Miami. And we did that Picasso deal. The two Picassos were recovered at the Louvre, by the way. It's where they were recovered, right by the pyramid. And the undercover French police were there. The guys found out that there was some kind of a leak of information out of Miami. So they thought I was the informant. So they put a hit on me. And so these individuals wanted to meet with me, and I had to go and meet with them. I met them at the Diplomat Hotel in the bar at the Diplomat. And I never carried a gun undercover because that would just create more danger. Whenever you carry a weapon, then the bad guy's going to have a weapon, and, it just escalates, ratchets up the problems. So I never carried a gun. But in that case, I carried two guns, one in each pocket. And the reason was because they had told me, I knew who they were. They had told me before that the way they killed people was with knives. They'd get you in a car and they'd stab you. And quite honestly, if that's the situation, by the time you can get a gun out in a car, you'll have been stabbed many times. Okay, that's just the way it is. So that's why I met them in a bar across from a table. So they'd have to come across the table to get to me. So those two times were interesting. I was able to talk about it. I said there must have been a wiretap or something. It wasn't me, and I had no idea what they were talking about. And I basically could talk about it. Since they wanted to do more deals, make more money, it was fairly easy to get them off the idea. So those were the two times where I kept up a little bit at night thinking about it. But hey, it's a living.
That's a hell of a career. I've learned a lot here. So Robert, thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, no worries. It was a pleasure to talk to you guys.
You've been listening to Robert K. Whitman discussing how to steal a masterpiece. Our producer for this show was Edwin Tran. Our researchers were Alex Smith and Alexandra Shokovich. To all our listeners and Patreon supporters, thank you so much for listening and supporting How to Get on a Watchlist.
If you enjoyed this show, please consider checking out our other content at Encyclopedia Geopolitica. We'd also appreciate it if you could subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, or support us on Patreon. Thanks for listening.